So what I've asked each of our panelists to do is to kind of focus on a ressourcement. That's a theology term for return to the sources, to return to this idea of a culture of life 28 years later, and to offer us some provisional thoughts about the relevance of this landmark idea and how it can help us think about building a culture of life, one that can heal divisions, renew the imagination, and inspire a civilization of love. Carter, I want to open with your thoughts. So John already alluded to this, but in Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II talks about democracy standing or falling with the values it embodies. And I'd like you to reflect for us a little bit on how this very core idea of a culture of life shapes the foundations necessary for democracy and how it should inspire and carry forward jurisprudence from this point forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you, Jess, for the invitation, and John and Bishop and my colleagues and everyone else. It's a pleasure to be here with you to discuss these important questions at the Blessed Mother's University, where we should be talking about these questions and do talk about these questions. So the first point, there are 2 points I'll make very briefly, one of which is a kind of procedural, lawyerly point, and the other one I think is a deeper and more interesting point. But the procedural, lawyerly point is absolutely essential. It's important for everyone to understand, lawyers and non-lawyers alike, that our conversation about how to shape law and policy and politics in a manner that reflects the intrinsic equal dignity of every person and the embodied and embeddedness of everyone in their relationality, and the fact that we are all, by virtue of our embodiment, vulnerable, finite, subject to natural limits, and therefore reciprocally dependent upon one another, and therefore any law that is to be intelligible has to take seriously that reality of our personal identity and flourishing. Before we could even have any of those conversations about substantive conversations about how to shape the law, Roe v. Wade had to be overturned. Okay, that's just an essential fact. As a logistical matter, as a procedural matter, as a jurisprudential matter, it tied the hands. And by the way, pursuant to an illegitimate power grab by the court that didn't have any sources in the text, history, or tradition of the Constitution, it bound the hands of the political branches of government to do anything meaningful, not just to protect unborn children, but to even have a conversation that about how we can protect mothers and babies and families in a comprehensive way, as we're called to do by St. John Paul II, as well as our Catholic social tradition more generally. The very first step had to be Roe v. Wade being overturned, and we have to acknowledge that, and we have to recognize that, because without that, none of this conversation would be entirely academic, and that's true of Planned Parenthood versus Casey. The entire line of jurisprudence from 1973 until 2022 had to be dismantled for us to have this conversation in the first instance. And what the court did in Dobbs was simply something very unusual. They restored power to the political branches. They devolved power, they released power, ill-gotten power that the court had absorbed, and gave it back to us. And now it's our responsibility to take that authority and to care for mothers, babies, and families, and build a culture of life and civilization of love now that we have the power to do that. So how do we proceed from a legal and jurisprudential and policy perspective? Well, all law, without exception, is irreducibly normative. It is grounded in a conception of goods to be pursued and harms to be avoided, and principles of justice and principles of equality and principles of freedom. But even more deeply, the law is rooted in what we Catholics call an anthropology. The law, and I think this echoes what John Paul II was saying in Evangelium Vitae, the law is grounded, it has to operate from a set of premises, usually unstated premises, about what human beings are and what our flourishing consists in. Why? Because law exists to protect and promote the flourishing of persons. So there's no avoiding an anthropology. It has to operate from a conception of what persons are, because the purpose of law itself is to protect and promote the flourishing of persons. If it didn't have an ex-ante conception of what persons are, then it would be unintelligible, it would be arbitrary, it would be capricious, it wouldn't be wise, it would be unjust. And these are in some ways the deeper problems that we've seen with the abortion jurisprudence, because Roe v. Wade and its progeny were rooted in a very, very specific and I think incomplete and false anthropology. And we could talk about that during the question period if you like. But now we have the opportunity to orient our laws and ground them in a vision of the person that takes seriously the fact, not that we're atomized individual wills seeking to pursue our own destinies that we discover by turning inward to interrogate the depths of our own sentiment, but instead we are, again, by virtue of the fact that we are enlivened bodies, we exist in a particular kind of relationship to one another. We are, as I said at the outset, we're vulnerable. We're finite, fragile beings in time. We have corruptible bodies. We get sick. We die. We need each other. We come into the world in a state that is completely and utterly dependent upon the beneficence of others for the sake of our very survival. And through the arc of our life, we depend on others. And we depend on what McIntyre calls networks of uncalculated giving and graceful receiving. For our survival, but then also to learn to be the thing that we're supposed to become, which is the kind of person that can make the good of another our own good without seeking anything in return, without counting the cost. Human beings, by virtue of our embodiment, are made for love and friendship, and the law has to take this into account. And translating that in a more concrete way, when we aim to care for the weak and the vulnerable, the elderly, the disabled, the poor, and children, including unborn children, we have to think about that web of interrelationship, and we have to ask the question, how do we take care of everybody? How do we take care of the unborn child? Of course, the unborn child needs to be protected in the law. But also, we need to extend care and concern and consideration to her mother. We have to understand the relationship, the context in which the human question of abortion arises is not two atomized strangers fighting over scarce resources, which is the way Roe v. Wade framed it, which is why they licensed the use of lethal violence of one party against the other. What we're talking about is a mother and her child and a father and a family and a community, sometimes in a crisis. And the reaction of any decent lawmaker, or community to that kind of a summons is to come to their aid and to provide for them as best we can. And what I've seen that has worked thus far in the wake of Dobbs, only made possible by Dobbs, is those jurisdictions that have taken a comprehensive view about how to grapple with this question. Some states Texas is a good example, has not just extended the protections of the law to the unborn child, but at the same time authorized $100 million, which isn't enough, but it's a good start. $100 million for alternative to abortion programs to try to support pregnancy resource centers, to try to not just that, but also to work to help support women in terms of poverty, healthcare, addiction. There's a racial justice component to this, of course, as well, that we all have to. It's all connected, and when we understand that, and when we proceed with that in mind, we're going to be successful, and we're going to live up to the standard of radical solidarity that Pope John Paul enjoined us to pursue, and hopefully, God willing, create a civilization of love.
Thanks, Carter. You brought up 2 points that I want to piggyback off of. First of all, the embeddedness and interrelationship of human persons with one another, and then, of course, your comment about racism. So we know that individuals are interdependent upon one another and different community systems. We also know that sort of life issues are interdependent upon one another. So with your mention of racism, I'd like to turn to Danielle. Danielle, we know that minority communities generally express disapproval of abortion, but also account for a disproportionate percentage of abortions sought. But sort of increasingly, anti-racism and abortion are becoming intertwined together, such that if you're against racism, by implication or extension, you are supposed to support abortion access. Can you give us some of your thoughts about the complexities here, about how to untangle those complexities, and a little bit about how, John Paul II's understanding of a culture of life can help us do that?
Yeah. So first of all, I'm exceedingly honored to be sitting amongst this caliber of persons, and I just appreciate the opportunity to address you all here at Our Ladies University. So let me just start out by telling you who I am and who I'm not, right? Right, just to orient everybody. So who I am is a faithful daughter of the Catholic Church, and by faithful, I mean I believe everything that the Church teaches, and I try my best to live it out on a day-to-day basis. I am a practicing Catholic, which means I try, I fail, and then I try again. I am a sinner. What I am not is an expert on the Black community writ large. I do not speak on behalf of my race, And yet, in a couple of moments, I'm going to speak on behalf of my race. So, as you go about your lives as individuals, know where you are oriented to, know who you are and who you are not. So, as my day job, this is part of my day job, I speak on behalf of the Catholic bishops of the United States on issues that pertain to race, and this is probably one of the thorniest of the crown of thorns, really, that make up the topic. So I'm going to go ahead and quote from the most recent document on racism that the USCCB has promulgated called Open Wide Our Hearts. Students, write that down. It's called Open Wide Our Hearts, the enduring call to love. If you have not read it, I highly recommend it. And read it sort of like Alexio, right? You can read just about anything like Alexio, see where it hits you in the heart, where it makes you happy, where it makes you sad, and then journal about those places and ask the Lord why you're upset. And then pray deeper into that to see where your call in this particular fight for humanity may be. Quoting from there, "It is not a secret that these are attacks on human life and that they have severely affected people of color who are disproportionately affected by poverty, targeted for abortion, have less access to health care, have the greatest numbers on death row, and are most likely to feel pressure to end their lives when facing serious illness." So let me do a little bit more reorientation. We need to understand where we are in relation to the history that we are inheritance of and the history that we are living out. We need to understand that between the year of emancipation and now, there have only elapsed 152 years. Let that sink in. 152 years, that's all it's been. How many generations is that, guys? That's only 4 generations. What's a generation? 40 years. You do the math. So transitioning into the topic at hand here, the percentage of the population, particularly speaking of African American people, 12% of the population in the United States, that's all Black folks are, and holding steady at that rate for several decades now. Why? Some figures report that without abortion, the population and the community would be double that percentage. There are, as you may know, 2/3 as many abortions in the Black community than amongst our sisters in the white community or European American sisters. And the problem that I see most within the pro-life movement is that we are all stats when it comes to the Black American and no heart, not caring about healthcare disparities, food deserts, safe and affordable housing, educational choice, and the Catholic Church is rapidly withdrawing from city centers. Why don't we care? And now on our heels of the celebration of the fall of Roe, we are now seeing the breakdown of laws that were designed to prevent abortion from becoming modern-day eugenics. What will be the result of over-the-counter abortions' impact on a community of women who die at almost 3 times the rate of their European American sisters when it comes to childbirth? So understand this, folks. It does not matter what socioeconomic category you fall in. If you are African American and you are carrying a child, you are some stats say hundreds times more likely to die in childbirth than European Americans. Undisputed. So make no mistake, we live in the midst of a bloodthirsty people. We live in the midst of a people who are rabidly yearning for the blood of the unborn. And we must recognize the deep impact of the demonic. Birth control opens the way to the eugenicist. Margaret Sanger said in Birth Control and Racial Betterment. And so what this really equals is a pure fact. Man and woman today, really, we just want to be God. We lack a proper anthropology of the human person and a definition of true freedom, and when and if we do have it, we fail to speak of the dignity of the body with equal zeal to all communities. We are brainwashed by the images that we see in the modern media. We are convinced that certain groups of people are too far gone. We white Catholics search for and are deeply mollified by disposable definitions of ideas such as critical race theory that will allow us to put the necessary space between us and these concepts of racial justice, putting those concepts in the trash, allowing us to construct desperately needed space between us and those communities that we don't understand. We painstakingly draw these boundaries in our brains that are grounded really just in desperation. We've mapped out for ourselves a landscape that convinces us that our eternal destiny is not bound up in the other. We lack the proper imagination about what it is to be human. Maybe somebody should write a book called that.
Maybe should win a lot of awards.
Lots of awards. So the truth is this: only what transcends us and our many affairs here on earth with all of our conflicting interests can unite us. Anthony Esselin said that. What we need is a radical reclamation of what it means to be human. We need saints willing to teach women the dignity of life itself, that choosing what one does with their body begins with making the choice to allow a man into her holy of holies. It is the reclamation of the theology of the body and the painful recognition of what 250 years of slavery brought down upon the women who ushered us into the world, not just Black Americans, but your ancestors too, because the truth of the matter is that many of my ancestors wet nursed your ancestors. So they grew big and strong on the milk of my ancestors. We are bound up together on a cellular level. The fruit of sin is chaos and contradiction. We have bastardized not only Martin Luther King, but also the gospel, and on some level, Christ himself. We do not understand what it means to be true Christians and one in Christ. We need to reclaim the sexual ethics that allowed Christianity to rip across the Middle East, rip down the Roman Empire, and allowed Christians to go happily to their death singing the praises of the Lord. Martin Luther King says the Negro cannot win if he is willing to sacrifice the futures of his children for immediate personal comfort and safety. He said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so on this issue, we are not done here. We must pass through, again, a new sort of middle passage. We have a choice now. We have a choice now. My community and yours has a choice now to enter into a new boat of our free choosing, freed of the shackles of the ideology of the culture of death, letting the light of Christ and Christ himself take us deep into the darkness of the ship, where we, with our brothers and sisters, wait for the coming of the new world. But the boat this time is the bark of Peter. That's it. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Speaking of reclaiming sort of the church's sexual ethic for a new generation, the ethic that drove early Christians to sing happily to their martyrdom, I'd like to bring in Angela Franks. And my question for you, Angela, is sort of along similar lines as that of Danielle. The relationship between feminism and abortion has been fraught since the early to mid 1960s, when abortion really became one of the legs of the feminist movement, and the history of that is complicated. But John Paul II, in his letter to the Fourth World Conference on Women in the United Nations, said that, quote, "a radical solidarity with women requires that underlying causes which make a child unwanted be addressed," unquote. I'm wondering if you can sort of unpack what a new vision of feminism grounded in the culture of life would mean, namely thinking about the role of institutions, communities, et cetera, in supporting the very bodily lived realities of women associated with fertility, pregnancy, motherhood, and child rearing.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really honored to have been invited to participate, and I really wish I could be there in person, though hearing that it's snowing makes me a little glad maybe that I'm safely here. When I was thinking about this topic, I was struck by I remembered a quote by Chesterton when he was writing on eugenics. He wrote about our upside down worldview, and he said, "We believe that the quote, the small wages and the income desperately shared are the fixed points, like day and night, the conditions of human life. Compared with them, marriage and maternity are luxuries, things to be modified to suit the wage market." And that's really what I want to focus on, the fact that we have this mistaken, this upside down impression that things that are fixed are actually malleable and things that are malleable are actually fixed. And part of the reason that we have this kind of upside down perspective is because for the male, maternity obviously is not at issue. The way that a male human being generates a child, biologically speaking, there's just not that much change that happens in the male human being, just from a biological point of view. And so that's why a man can go work 9 to 5 days a week, regardless of what's going on at home, whether or not somebody's pregnant, somebody's about to have a child. This was the world in which the feminists, starting with the earliest feminists, were recognizing that there was a world of work and a world of education that were structured according to a man who doesn't have the same kind of biological rhythms as a woman. My colleague, Erica Bacchiacchi, who published a book a couple of years ago now with Notre Dame Press on the rights of women, she calls this reproductive asymmetry, that there's an asymmetry between men and women when it comes to what happens in human generation, that in fact women do more of the heavy lifting when it comes to human generation. If we think a little bit about the maybe the normal timeline that's laid out to your average middle class high school student, say, so you go to college or college from 18 to 22, maybe you take off some of your 20s and enjoy your single life or something like that. Maybe you go right into pursuing a career. If you're intellectual, so in my, kind of my realm of experience, you go off to grad school. Maybe you get your doctorate between ages, say, 28 and 32. If you're lucky enough to get a tenure track job, you go right into that. You have 7 years till tenure. And so, it's not uncommon to hear advice to people entering college to put relationships and family life on the back burner until you get tenure. So maybe, you get, if you're lucky, you get tenure around ages 35 to 39. If you've been foolish enough to put off marriage at this point, and if you're a woman between ages 35 to 39, there are a lot fewer marriageable men available. Some are married, some are ordained, some, that's just the fact of it. So first of all, you maybe have a relationship problem, but you have a woman has a bigger problem than just the relationship problem. Namely, she's got a reproductive problem. A man is roughly as fertile at 35 as he is 10 years before, but that's not true of a woman. So this is when Erica talks about reproductive asymmetry, this is what it looks like in the sort of day-to-day life that women cannot simply follow a male timetable when it comes to pursuing education and pursuing career if they also want a family. And of course, sometimes they don't realize that they want a family until it's really too late to have a family. So both first wave and second wave feminists recognized reproductive asymmetry, although they didn't use that language. For first wave feminists, the problem that they were trying to grapple with, so kind of the crux of the problem, was that really twofold. First of all, vice, and secondly, social structures that prevented women from achieving full human flourishing. So vice, they saw very much in like problems of drunkenness, of infidelity, of family abandonment, and then social structures that sometimes enabled or allowed those kinds of vices, but that also prevented women from being able to be fully educated, for example, so that they couldn't really actualize their potential as rational. They couldn't really exercise their rational nature. So they saw a twofold problem of vice and social structures. And so their solution was, first of all, moral exhortation, and then secondly, to change social structures. Second wave feminists, and I'm thinking here of Margaret Sanger, who was already mentioned, as being the one who really initiates this change into second wave feminism. Margaret Sanger said that first wave feminists got it all wrong. That the problem was certainly not vice for Sanger. She was not at all interested in morality, but also not social structures. For Sanger, the problem was female fertility. And this is, we're so used to this being presented as the problem that we don't even notice how strange and how absolutely revolutionary this was in the history of feminist thought and the history of political thought in general. Instead of saying that we need to change structures and we need to change hearts, Sanger said, we need to change female bodies. And this was exceptionally influential because she founded Planned Parenthood. She founded institutions that continued this kind of way of thinking. And so if we go back to Chesterton's point, what's fixed, what's malleable? It would seem that the second wave proposed solution of fixing female fertility, if female fertility is the problem, then making women infertile would be the solution. That actually doesn't seem like a very plausible way of proceeding if you think about Chesterton, because surely biology is one of those things that are fixed, and the structures, the things that the first wave feminists were looking at, virtue and structures, those kinds of things are things that you can actually change. But what Sanger realized is that to change biology, you had to introduce technology into the picture. And so what you get with second wave feminism is a real deal with the devil in surrendering human generation really over to technology and its uncertain mercies. And so you see that with Sanger, with contraception. Sanger was not pro-life in any meaningful sense, but she really didn't think, she was naive enough to think that abortion would just fall away if everybody had access to contraception. And we know now that that's false. But beyond her, you had people promoting abortion. You had people promoting artificial reproductive technology. So by the time you get to the 1970s, you have somebody like Shulamith Firestone who says, quote, "We are no longer just animals. Humanity has begun to transcend nature." And for Firestone, we do that through technology. So with Firestone, you get this weird marriage between a kind of debased Plato of the Republic, where women will will turn over human generation to machines, basically, and rear children in common. And so women are completely detached from the process of human generation, all for the sake of going after what is perceived to be the core of the problem, namely the fertile female body. So I think you can already see, I hope, what an unintendedly misogynistic approach this is to the question of women's rights and female flourishing. One of the many problems with this approach is, so first, as I've already mentioned, it's misogynistic. Secondly, it doesn't work, which sometimes it seems people forget about, so it's like, well, just people are conceiving children that they weren't planning for, and so we'll just give them contraception. But all of these technologies have user failure, they have method failure. So a contracepting society actually aborts more. There's actually more abortions rather than fewer abortions. At the other end of the reproductive lifestyle, so if we go back to our 35 to 39-year-old professor who suddenly now can't get pregnant, if she's 35, maybe she has about a 25% chance of getting a child through artificial reproductive technology. If she waits till she's over 40, the odds drop to around 7%. And so this promise that you buy into this male structured timeline of education and work, and you can have your children down the road through technology if you want, like it's over promising, because that's not actually the result that we get. The deeper problem, of course, is that this technological approach to female fertility perpetuates a lie, which is that it's not human relationships that fundamentally make us happy. It's worldly success, it's earning money, it's ambition, and human relationships are unimportant to that. And in fact, our biological humanity, our generative humanity, is not important to human happiness. There's a woman, Miriam Zoll, who was a Planned Parenthood volunteer, really completely bought into the whole second wave feminist project. And then after many years, she tried to have a child. She suddenly wanted to have a child. And it's very poignant what she writes. She writes, just because the doctor appointments, the injections, the egg transfers, and the dashed hopes are over, it does not mean the trauma is over. The sense of violation that many women say they feel years later after doing artificial reproductive technology, coupled with the deep, deep sadness of not having born a child, lingers in our lives like a persistent mosquito buzzing in a dark room. Ironically, for the first time in my life, I had actually wanted my identity to be defined by my female biology. I wanted my daily routines to be dictated by an infant's needs, rather than having to actively choose and construct a life, end quote. So obviously, I'm spending most of my time here talking more about the culture of death than the culture of life, but I think it's important to see the problem, which is this male template of institutions that women are expected to just fit into, and that their fertility somehow will just be figured out on the side. You have abortion, you have contraception, you just figure out your fertility on the side. Like, that's not our job as corporations or universities to worry about that. You figure that out. And it just simply does not work. Because of reproductive asymmetry, it does not work. And it is an injustice to women to ask them to mold themselves for women's biology and relationships to be the malleable thing, rather than institutions, including college campuses and academia, to be the thing that adapts to women's biology. So I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A, especially talking about universities in particular. But thank you again for this really important conversation and for inviting me.
Thank you, Angela. Charlie, we're going to close out this portion of our conversation with you. So you've done a lot of work, trying to create spaces in public discourse that sort of define the homogenous categories that our conversations around abortion usually unfold in. And so I'm wondering if you could reflect on how the framework of a culture of life can help structure better conversations about abortion that overcome polarization, that help heal society, and that renew a civilization of love.
I'll do my best.
No big deal.
I'll do my best. Thank you, Bishop, and everyone for coming. As you'll see towards the end of my remarks, a culture of life that we've talked about today in which mother and baby are protected and supported is wildly popular. But conversations about that are incredibly, incredibly rare. And so I'm just so grateful to be part of a conversation like this. This kind of conversation can only really happen in places like this. I think John and Jess and Carter have pulled off something amazing to have this happen in a consistent way here at Notre Dame. I've been around the block and it just doesn't happen in many places. So again, I feel very fortunate to be here at a place that is not only our ladies' university, but I think it's a place that may be a safe space for using a football metaphor. So just as a quarterback needs to lead his receiver and throw the ball not where he is now, but where he will be in a few seconds, so we as a pro-life movement need to think about not where the culture is now, if we want to be persuasive in the public sphere, build alliances, appeal to people with different sources of ultimate concern, but think about where we're going. So let me briefly suggest some things about where I think we're going and use that as a springboard for my remarks. First, though pro-lifers, including me, have spent a ton of time discussing the moral status of the fetus and prenatal child, I actually think this is a battle we're winning in the culture, if not the academy. And not in law yet, but I think that's coming. I was struck by a Washington Post article a few days ago about this underground network now that is developing, networks that are forming to get abortion pills to people and living in places that are no longer where it's no longer legal. When discussing in the context in which the pill is offered to women beyond the 10-week limit currently, that's what the FDA says, don't use this beyond 10 weeks. Quote, this is from the Post article. The distributor refers such cases to an abortion doula, she's known for many years, who counsels them over text about exactly what they will see when they pass the pregnancy. A 12-week fetus is roughly the size of a plum. A 15-week fetus the size of an apple. This is the Washington Post. These cases in particular present significant legal risk to the patient who has to figure out how to secretly dispose of the remains. This is still a quote. The abortion doula said she often sends a small amount of acid so the client can dissolve some of the fetus and bury whatever is left. The mafia. Quote, I tried to emotionally prepare them and say, it's going to look like a baby, end quote. Wow. It isn't that often one gets that kind of honesty from an outlet like the Washington Post. But those who want to deny that the prenatal child killed by abortion is anything other than a human baby are losing the battle. This is especially true given technology, which is making this inconvenient truth readily available to all. Even at the very early stages, before most women even know they're pregnant, we now know through technology and, embryology textbooks, that there is a 4-chambered heart pumping blood unidirectionally, despite what you may have heard otherwise. Add to the development of technology the massive decline in fertility and population currently underway and the exponential desperation that was just mentioned that so many individuals and cultures have now and will have in the future about having more babies in the future. I propose that we will be very, very explicit about the reality and goodness of prenatal human beings going forward. This Friday, I'm presenting at a Radcliffe event at Harvard on another post-Roe, post-Dobbs event. And they asked me for my remarks to choose a word or phrase that could be kind of projected in the background as I was speaking. I chose the phrase radical equality. I think this is where we need to set our focus as a pro-life movement for the future. How do we wrestle with the radical equality of mother and child in a context that is unimaginably intimate, an embodied relationship that's unlike any other, where two people create and share an organ, the placenta? Is just an astonishing thing to think about. One thing I've discovered throughout the years as a teacher and activist, and even sometimes as an academic, is that most people who favor abortion rights do not have the supposed non-personhood of the fetus as one of their reasons. Indeed, most have clear cutoffs in mind for when they think abortion ought to be broadly illegal. And consider this, the folks who have the disproportionate number of abortions in this country, mostly economically vulnerable people of color, are also the folks who are likely to identify as pro-life and be against abortion, as we've already heard. It is a diabolical thing that we explicitly and structurally coerce so many vulnerable women to have abortions that they know are killings of their own children. There are so many things we could invoke here as reasons for this. We've already talked about several of them, but let me just say a few. The relationship between abortion and intimate partner violence looms very large here. The relationship between abortion and poverty, the relationship between abortion and lack of childcare, paternity leave, and more. The future of the abortion debate, again, I propose anyway, the place where we need to throw the ball in order to meet the receiver will be the place where we can focus on the radical equality of both mother and child. As most of you know, even within this framework, Judith Jarvis Thompson, lots of people will still be broadly pro-choice, but With that in mind, we still need to continue to develop and promote a consistent anthropology to counteract that. Much of what we heard about already today is what I wanted to talk about, but it makes my remarks shorter. An anthropology which resists seeing the child as competing with her mother, as many of the bodily autonomy arguments used by our opponents often assume, but instead offer a rich anthropology. Again, there were some great remarks already mentioned, but one that emphasizes connection, mutual vulnerability, interdependence, responsibility, concern for the disabled, nonviolence, and more. With that goal in mind, I think, though, if we're honest with ourselves, I think we need to acknowledge that though the pro-life movement has always made women a priority, and the charges that we only care about people before they're born are absurd, we have been led, in my view, by far too tight connections to a Reagan-style Republican Party that rejects the role of government in favor of virtually only private solutions. There is nothing Catholic about this approach, and there's nothing about this approach that serves babies and mothers on the whole. We, of course, need to make prudential judgments about the often unintended consequences of policies and make sure they don't do more harm than good. That's important. But we need to as a pro-life movement, we need to fully divest from any sort of a priori ideological commitment to libertarianism or quote-unquote small government. We need an all-of-the-above approach, whatever works. And if you think that the pro-life movement can't be motivated to do that or be successful in doing that, I refer you to a debate over the 2017 budget when Paul Ryan and company tried to avoid picking winners and losers, which apparently at the time included getting rid of the adoption tax credit. Pro-lifers went to war and defeated that, much to the delight of people like me and Carter and others, so many others who have adopted children. So many of us could not possibly have done that without the adoption tax credit. And again, with the theme of thinking about the future, I think it's fair to say that both the creative destruction of the old Republican Party and the Dobbs decision really puts us in a new phase for the pro-life movement, one that is very hopeful for moving in the kind of direction that you've heard here this afternoon. One might call the pro-life movement before and just after Roe as pro-life 1.0. For those of you that know the work of Daniel K. Williams and his amazing book, Defenders of the Unborn, you know this is an astonishingly different pro-life movement than one we've had for the last 30 or 40 years. It included anti-war people who would one week go to protest the Vietnam War and then the next week go and protest against abortion. I highly recommend that book if you're interested in more of that. With Reaganite fusionism of libertarians, neocons, and the religious right, we had pro-life 2.0. And though it may have been necessary at the time, I've already discussed some limitations of that approach, especially for our current moment. The pro-life movement now finds itself on the cusp of the 3.0 version of ourselves. And many of the people in this room and watching online will help decide what that version looks like. I've proposed an all-of-the-above approach towards the goal of radical equality for both mother and child as driving pro-life 3.0. Let me close by answering a critic who might be thinking that this is unrealistic or simply can't work. I acknowledge that often is an appropriate criticism for ivory tower academics. But I'll do my best to offer three quick thoughts here. First, as the move from 1.0 to 2.0 showed, the pro-life movement can and has proven it can change very dramatically. So it's already been done. Second, many pro-life leaders are already moving in this direction. Many of them are in this room. I helped lead a group of pro-life leaders signing a statement along these lines. It was signed by everyone from Lila Rose, Eric Scheidler, Abby Johnson, Russell Moore, Kristen Hawkins, Catherine Glenn Foster, and many others. In fact, this was such an astonishing thing for people who don't know that this is already happening. The New York Times decided to do an article which covered it. Third and finally, this is an approach that is very much supported by public opinion. I promised you this at the beginning. I'll try to deliver here at the end. One of the more astonishing and underreported findings of the Marist poll that the Knights of Columbus commission twice a year is specifically about the following question. Quote, is it possible to have laws which protect both the health and well-being of a woman and the life of the unborn? Question mark. Do you have any guesses about what the percentage is for yes? In June, it was 80%. Let me just read that again. Is it possible to have laws which protect both the health and well-being of a woman and the life of the unborn? Now let's get real. This is Knights of Columbus, but Marist is a very serious polling organization. So even if it's like 15 points less than that, it's still an astonishingly high number. That was in June. Do you know what it was in January to this month? 90%. It went from 80 to 90% in 6 months. Got better since Dobbs, not worse. Last time I checked, I think even approval ratings for cockroaches broke 10%. I think that's right, actually. I'm not sure of anything that in the United States that 90% of us agree on. Can you think about that? So let's intentionally move with confidence into a pro-life 3.0 future that's focused on radical equality.
Friends, we have had a very robust conversation, and I would like to recognize Bishop Rhodes now to come up and give us some final remarks. If we have some time for Q&A afterward, we'll be happy to stick around.
Thank you, Jessica. And thank you to these excellent speakers. Powerful. I came here principally because of the students of ND Right to Life. I wanted you to know of my support and also how proud I am of all of you and what you're doing here on campus. And how important your witness is for the Catholic identity and mission of the University of Notre Dame. After the Dobbs decision, many of us were caught a bit off guard by the tidal wave of negativity and disinformation from abortion proponents and hostile media. In many places, anger at the Dobbs decision was expressed through violence, intimidation, and vandalism, including a lot of Catholic churches. Not that we did not expect pushback and opposition, but I don't think we expected such an organized assault with so much misinformation, sensational and false claims about harm to women as a result of the Dobbs decision. And much of the anger was stoked by well-funded pro-abortion groups and political ideologues and their media allies. On many, if not most, U.S. college and university campuses today, it's kind of unpopular to praise the Dobbs decision or to oppose abortion rights and speak for the right to life of the unborn. Abortion proponents also seek to promote their ideology at Catholic colleges and universities, either from the outside or from the inside. Of course, it's particularly scandalous when promotion of abortion takes place at Catholic universities and colleges, since it strikes at a foundation of what makes a university truly Catholic: respect for the life and dignity of every human being. Students, I not only wish to thank you for your strong and courageous witness to the sacredness of human life here at Notre Dame, but to impress upon you how important your witness is to me and to the church. And besides thanking you, I wanted to be here today to encourage you in the midst of the opposition we face since the Dobbs decision. We must not succumb to the temptation of lethargy because of the judicial victory of Dobbs, or the temptation of fear in the face of criticism or attacks. There's so much more that needs to be done in this post-Dobbs America. Not only is there much work to be done on the state levels of government, but also on the federal and local levels, and many of you are at the March for Life in Washington. But even more deeply, we have much work to do on the cultural level. Charlie's remarks gave me a little hope, that a little more hope probably than I had with those statistics or those polls. But working for the transformation of culture, conversion of hearts and minds, so many people, especially of your own generation. Our greatest challenge is to build a culture of life in our nation and a civilization of love in our world. It's interesting, almost every speaker used either the word diabolical or demonic. I happened to notice that. And I just want to give you a little example. The attacks on our women's pregnancy centers. It just boggled my mind. The number of abortions in our diocese have been cut in half. Pretty amazing. And I think primarily because of these pregnancy centers that we have, especially the women's care centers. It's remarkable the number of women who've been helped, and many African American, many Latinas, and many who are lower income people. And the method is love, material assistance, especially with health care during pregnancy and after the birth of the babies. So some of the things that our speakers have mentioned, and yet opponents who I would say it puzzles me, I don't think we can really call them pro-choice. It would be more pro-abortion. Allow me to share with you a personal story. From this past weekend, Friday night, I received a phone call from a young adult that I know well. His voice was emotional, and his words interrupted by sobs as he told me that he and his pregnant wife, the parents of 2 young children, had just had a routine visit with her obstetrician and an ultrasound in which they had been happy and excited to learn the sex of their baby. She was 20 weeks pregnant. Imagine they went in very happy, excited, and received with the ultrasound the devastating news that their baby had died. The baby was probably 17 or 18 weeks that she had died, but that he had died, but she was 20 weeks, but didn't know that the baby had died in her womb. They learned that their baby was a boy. So the father asked if there was any chance I could come to the hospital and pray with them after she was induced into labor to deliver their deceased son. And of course I said yes. I had a funeral the next morning, and I said that if she gives birth before the funeral mass that I had, I would be over there for sure. So early Saturday morning, the father let me know that the baby had been delivered, so I went over to the hospital before the funeral. And I entered the room, I embraced them both, and expressed my condolences. And lying in the hospital bed, the young mother was holding the little baby, cradled lovingly in her hands. Now, I've seen many small babies in visiting NICU units during hospital visits. I always marvel at the little bodies of prematurely born infants. But this was the smallest baby I had ever seen in person. Beautifully formed, knit together in his mother's womb, as Scripture tells us. I gazed on the tiny arms and legs, fingers and toes. I mentioned the babies to them. I said, look, the baby's arms were crossed and the hands were touching each other. I said, it looks like he's praying. With love and deep emotion, we prayed together. I read from Scripture and used the prayers that the church has in situations of miscarriages and stillbirths. And during that, they named the child Jamie, and I spoke of how Jamie would always be part of their family as we entrusted his soul to the love of our Father in heaven. They would continue to grieve the loss of their baby, but they did so with faith and hope in God's love. Now that experience has stayed with me the last few days, over the weekend up till today, especially because this is a time we mark the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. And really, I felt in a new way the horror of abortion as I thought of the many babies the age of Jamie who were not lost by miscarriage but killed by abortion. It has stirred within me a renewed conviction that our battle to defend the precious lives of the unborn must continue through education and formation of consciences, political advocacy, loving care of pregnant mothers, support for expectant mothers and fathers in difficult circumstances, and love for their unborn children. I'm reminded of words of Pope Benedict XVI. I quote, God's love does not differentiate between the newly conceived infant still in his or her mother's womb and the child or young person or the adult and the elderly person. God does not distinguish between them because he sees an impression of his own image and likeness in each one. Life is the first good received from God and is fundamental to all others. To guarantee the right to life for all and in an equal manner for all is the duty upon which the future of humanity depends. So we must not be discouraged by opposition when we stand up for the most vulnerable and defenseless members of the human family. We must not waver in our commitment to the protection of the unborn. These children are not disposable objects. They represent God's presence in the world. We must intelligently and lovingly help those who are pro-choice to realize that the freedom to kill is not true freedom. As Pope Benedict says, it's a tyranny that reduces the human being to slavery. The evil of abortion brings so much suffering to the lives of individuals, families, and societies, often leaving indelible marks on those involved. We are truly pro-women when we help women and men to choose life, to say yes to the life of the new human beings they have conceived, the choice that will lead to true peace of mind and heart. We must help them to realize their capacity to love, even in difficult circumstances. And as I think the speakers have mentioned, we're called to live what St. John Paul II called radical solidarity with mothers and their babies, born and preborn. So students, I pray you will be steadfast in your witness to the gospel of life in this post-Dobbs world, and that you will persevere with the church in building a culture of life. We still face a long and difficult struggle, and the church needs you. May the Lord's love and grace guide and sustain you in your service of life. The Blessed Virgin Mary is the model of how life should be welcomed and cared for. She's the patroness of this university. May she intercede for you that you will continue to bear witness to the gospel of her Son, the gospel of life and love, and serving the Catholic identity and mission of Notre Dame. Thank you very much.